Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, where we talk about the American Revolution 6 days a week. Now, today's founder is Benjamin Franklin. For those of you who are new here, usually this channel I like to focus on the lesser-known American revolutionaries and more obscure stories from the American founding for several reasons. First of all, it's a lot of fun, and second of all, a lot of people were involved in creating the United States as we know it, and it's always good to focus on the broader picture. But in doing so, I've noticed that I've left out stories specifically about the founding fathers, or what I like to call the Big Six. Basically, Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton. Now, these founders do make their way onto this channel quite frequently in passing, talking about other American founders. But I thought for starting today and the next several weeks, I'd talk about each of these very important and rightfully acknowledged leaders of the American Revolution who, while they do get the attention they deserve, unlike most of the people we talk about here, they're still very important to know about. So I'm going to do a broad swath of the life starting today of Benjamin Franklin. I'm doing them in order of date of birth. So let's talk a little bit about Benjamin Franklin. Well, you may know Franklin was actually born in Massachusetts, and he was older than most of the American revolutionaries. As a teenager, he was fortunate enough to have an older brother who had a printing press, and therefore he was able to learn the printing trade, which would suit him very nicely because he would run away from home, for lack of a better term, as a teenager, and thereafter make his way to Philadelphia, where he would establish himself and spend most of the rest of his life. After a brief trip to England, he comes back and, well, he starts a printing press of his own, and he starts pretty much everything. Now, George Washington is often referred to as the first American, but usually I like to call Washington the first citizen. Ben Franklin is really the first American because not only does he establish a printing press and then becomes the king's man and establishes the post office, but he ends up being one of the first people to ever franchise his business, investing in or outright selling rights to his name on the printing press in other colonies at the time. Furthermore, he starts hospitals, he starts fire departments, he helps build roads and charitable organizations, and literally building, especially in the city of Philadelphia, but throughout the American colonies. So Franklin really starts becoming a little bit revolutionary in the early 1750s. Now, by this point, he's not even 50 years old, but already retired because he's made himself so wealthy and made himself well known for his science experiments and just being Benjamin Franklin. So in 1754, he puts together the Albany Conference, sometimes called the Albany Congress. And the Albany Conference was in Albany, New York, right before the French and Indian War starts. And everyone, there's several colonies come to meet, and they all say, hey, what's going on with these Canadians and the French and the Native Americans? How can we unite as separate colonies to defend ourselves together? And this was one of the first times the separate colonies really wanted to work together on a large scale. There had been intercolonial cooperation up to this point, but never really a massive, from the top down, how do we all do this together outlook. Now, again, the main goal was defense. They were very concerned that while the French and the British armies were fighting each other, the Native Americans would be coming for the colonists, and they wanted to work together. Now, nothing would come of this except for the fact that for the first time, many people were starting to work together. In fact, many future signers of the Declaration of Independence were at that first meeting 20 years earlier in 1754. Just the next year, and I do want to throw this in here, the next year, Franklin goes down to Virginia where he's meeting with Royal Governor Braddock about the French and Indian War when he runs into a young soldier named George Washington. And Washington recognized Benjamin Franklin because at this point, as I said, Franklin had retired, but he had already established himself not just as a printing press owner and a scientist and a philanthropist, but as a writer. And George Washington, along with many of the other founders we'll meet along the way, grew up reading Poor Richard's Almanac. So Franklin was already famous in the colonies, and that's when, a few years after this, in 1757, he is sent to London as a representative of Pennsylvania. And Franklin would spend the better part of the next 20 years away from the colonies. He would be there from 57 until 1775, although he did come back to the colonies for a brief period, about a year and a half. Really, he spent almost 20 years over in London, first working to represent just Pennsylvania as an agent, as it was called, but not just Pennsylvania. He eventually also represents Massachusetts and New Jersey, of which his son became royal governor, and Georgia. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he's over there, and then the Stamp Act Congress happens, and all the colonists are back in America kind of getting upset about what's going on over in London, and Ben Franklin's their guy, supposed to be representing them, and Franklin's getting these letters from the colonies saying, Ben, what are you doing, dude? Like, why are they giving us more taxes? Why do we have to stamp everything? Why are they, this, that, and the other thing that were the complaints that would eventually make their way into the Declaration of Independence were first being sent to Benjamin Franklin in England. And Ben Franklin would go over to Parliament and be like, do you look at what they're not happy over there? Of course, like most colonists, Ben Franklin originally wanted to find a resolution and stay part of what they considered the greatest, most free empire in the history of the world. That was the goal, was to stay together, but insult after insult kept coming their way, and Franklin actually would go speak to the members of Parliament and say, guys, this is not good. Like, they're really upset. You need to fix this. And eventually, he's taking so much of the blame and so much of the heat that Ben Franklin decides to go back to the colonies. He throws his hands in the air and says, there's nothing to be done here. And he goes back to the colonies, and although he's not necessarily calling for independence right away, he is already one of the more radical people when he gets back. And that's why very quickly he comes back, and in 1775, and he is sent to the Second Continental Congress. And it's at the Second Continental Congress that he meets John Adams, and he would meet Thomas Jefferson. And famously, he would work with these two gentlemen, among many, many others, to establish the Declaration of Independence. And I did skip a little bit, because in the meantime, Franklin helps create the Navy. He helps assess the Continental Army. He actually goes to review the Continental Army. He takes a trip up to Canada to try to recruit the French onto their side. And this is just in a year and a half that he's back from England before he sets sail for France. He does all this in about a year and a half. Really organized everything. Organized the secret committee. Really is one of the impetuses of pushing these rebellious colonies towards independence, and to creating the army and funding the war to achieve that independence. Now again, as I said, he was only back home after 20 years abroad. He's only home for a year and a half, during which time he sends Silas Deane over to France as an undercover agent, and then he himself leaves America and goes to France to act as the more or less ambassador to France on behalf of the United States. So Franklin goes over there. He is given a lot of the credit, although I will say, first of all, winning the Battle of Saratoga, thanks Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, was a huge impetus for getting the French to support the Americans. But as I said, he had already sent Silas Deane, who had been working covertly over there for quite some time, to get French support. But Franklin shows up, and what's interesting is while Franklin was over in England for those 20 years, he was looked at as a country bumpkin. Okay, we'll listen to you, Benjamin, but we don't really care what you have to say. But when Benjamin goes to France, as opposed to being upset about being called a country bumpkin while he was in England, when he goes to France, he loves it, because everyone loves this country bumpkin who happens to be the doctor who tamed lightning from the skies, the very man who had built the Postal Service, the first real international communication, so to speak. Although the colonies, now we think of the United States as one nation. At the time, the colonies, and even after the Revolution, the states did see themselves as separate nations, and Franklin tied them together. Again, he was famous by the time he even arrived in France, and the weight he carried there was extraordinarily important. Now, while he's there, they are able to get the French support. Again, thank you to the Battle of Saratoga. And then Franklin is there for almost a decade, 1776 until it's 1784, so 8 years. Again, he's gone. And so that's almost 30 years he's in Europe, but he still counts among the highest, if not the highest, most important American founders, because the work he was doing on behalf of the United States over in Europe, which at the time was seen as the center of the world. Now, Franklin does eventually come back to the United States when he's replaced by Thomas Jefferson, who, again, they've been keeping up correspondence, but he had only known briefly at the Second Continental Congress, though I will remind you, John Adams did hang out in France. We will be getting to him in just 2 weeks. Now, Franklin ends up coming back to the United States, and he's immediately chosen as president of Pennsylvania, or what we would know as governor. And he spends 3 years as governor of Pennsylvania, but by this point, he's already into his 80s. He is very much older. He suffers from ill health. He's in a lot of pain from not only gout, but the stones, which he called the kidney stones. But he ends up essentially retiring to the Constitutional Convention. And Franklin goes to the Constitutional Convention because he knew that he had achieved such a position in society that just being there gave the institution the weight it deserves. Now, to be fair, George Washington and also, I should mention, Robert Morris were also there, and their attendance also gave this body great weight in the considerations of the country when the ratification of the Constitution was starting to be debated. But Franklin was there. He doesn't participate as much as you might expect because, again, he is old and he's starting to get sick. I'll remind you, he retired in his 40s. 30 years before this, he had already been retired and been overseas almost the entire time. Franklin does go to the Constitutional Convention, much like the Declaration. He signs the United States Constitution. He is for it. He doesn't promote it too much. I will say while he's there, he's not the most involved in the discussions. In fact, there is at least one occasion where Franklin motions to do something and everyone is kind of like, okay, thanks, Dr. Franklin. Great. Thank you so much for your support. And then they kind of carry on without really even discussing what he recommended. Although also at this point, so the Constitutional Convention happens, and Ben Franklin, instead of going out there promoting the Constitutional Convention, and this is very important, he becomes the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. Apologies if that's not the exact title, but he becomes the leader of the organization that wants to abolish slavery in Pennsylvania. And in fact, almost as soon as the United States Congress meets for the first time, Ben Franklin sends them a letter saying, we need to get rid of slavery. Now, I know at this point it seems like he's a little late to the game, but again, this is fairly early, and we're talking about how many decades before the Civil War, and just a few years after Pennsylvania itself had abolished slavery in the state. And then, so Franklin does see Washington become president, and he sends a really nice letter to to George Washington, saying, essentially saying, I wish I died 2 years ago because of how much pain I'm always in, but if there is one thing that makes it all worthwhile is I get to see you take over as president of this new nation. It's really a beautiful letter. And then just about a year after George Washington dies, in April of 1790, just about a year after George Washington becomes president, in April of 1790, Ben Franklin passes away. And it is the end of an era. And again, he is the first American because the slew of things, as I listed before, that he's done, and just his embodiment of the revolution, the pull you up the bootstraps of America is embodied in Benjamin Franklin. And so, as I said earlier, I usually focus on the more random founders, but I thought it would be nice to give a big overview of Benjamin Franklin. And every Thursday for the next few weeks, I'm going to do the big six. Again, in order of birth, it's Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. No, Hamilton. Monroe? Ugh, well, I'll do it on Monroe anyway. That's what happens when I go live. Say it wrong, got to correct myself. So I did attach an article I wrote in the description below about the death of Benjamin Franklin because the French respond to his death in a very interesting way, and there's a weird infighting in Congress between the House of Representatives and the United States Senate because of his death. So definitely check that out. If you're new here, make sure you hit like and subscribe. I put out more random videos about obscure founders mostly, but if you want to learn about the other big six, as I call them, or what most people call, again, the founding fathers, subscribe. Be here next week. We also have a bunch of interviews coming up. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will be back with trivia like every Friday tomorrow.